Okay, good morning. Thank you all for joining us. I know it's early, but still. Our first session today deals with energy, security, and economic developments, prospects, challenges, and sanctions? Yes, sanctions, okay? One does not have to be a Marxist or even a former Marxist to accept the proposition that to a large degree, political, social, and cultural developments are based on economics. And at the same time, in today's world economies and economics, these are closely tied with matters of energy. The implication of all of these for security concerns, I think, are clear to all. I would like to note that in the initial planning of this conference, it was Professor Mordechai Abir himself who suggested that a session be devoted to these matters, and I believe that we have put together an excellent panel to present a broad picture in the Middle East today. Professor Abir also made it clear that he thought it would be an appropriate gesture if the session would be in memory of his former mentor, Professor David Ayalon of the Hebrew University, who passed away in 1998 at the age of 84. Personally, I could only concur warmly with this suggestion, as I was also a student of the late Professor David Ayalon. Generally, when we think of the scholarly legacy of Professor Ayalon, the Islamic world in the Middle Ages first comes to mind, especially the study of the institution of military slavery, or the world of the Mamluks, as they are usually known. Professor Ayalon's many studies in this area, which were written and published over more than a 50-year period, were truly pioneering, and he laid the groundwork for a whole realm of scholarly endeavor, which is continuing and flourishing until today. I noted yesterday David Ayalon's early work in lexicography, finding expression in the great modern Arab Hebrew dictionary, which was it was compiled and then published in 1947, together with his friend and colleague Pesach Shenan. However, not everybody knows that David Ayalon was also a student of modern Middle Eastern history and affairs, particularly early in his career. He did not, however, produce many publications in this area, but he did teach it in various courses, particularly in the 50s and 60s. He was always proud of this expertise, not the least in the area of energy. In fact, David Ayalon would boast that in the 50s, he was perhaps the first person in the world to teach a course on the question of oil in the Middle East. As far as I'm aware, this is true. Here, like in his better-known studies on the Mamluks, David Ayalon was a path-breaking scholar, laying the foundations for further research and study in an important area. We honor his memory this morning at this session, and we are very pleased that Professor Miriam Rosen Ayalon could be here this morning with us and join us in the commemoration. We can now turn to our lectures, and I'm honored to present the first lecturer. Our first lecturer is Professor Anthony H. Cordesman, who holds the Arlie A. Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He also acts as a national security analyst for ABC News in the United States. He is a recipient of the Department of Defense Distinguished Service Medal, and during his time at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, he has completed a wide variety of studies on energy, U.S. strategy and defense plans, defense programming and budgeting, NATO modernization, Chinese military power, the lessons of modern warfare, proliferation, counterterrorism, armed national building, the security of the Middle East, and the Afghan and Iraq conflicts. So I think we should invite Professor Cordisman here more often. Professor Cordisman is author of a number of studies, and in fact, I have here the names of 5 books that were published just in 2009. I'll just give 2 titles to give an idea. Saudi Arabia, National Security in a Troubled Region, and Iranian Weapons of Mass Destruction, the Birth of a Regional Nuclear Arms Race, ? So we're very, very pleased that Professor Cordisman was able to come here just before the holiday, and we're looking forward very much to his lecture. Thank you.
I'm going to need, ladies and gentlemen, I have to apologize because I'm going to violate some of the principles of public speaking this morning. I'm going to race you through a complex PowerPoint, and it is a PowerPoint which is a summary of an analysis that I have done for our command in the Central Command region. So the full briefing and all of the details will be on the university website, and all I want to do today is make a few points about what energy in transition is in the Middle East, both in military terms and in terms of security. Now, the problem that we in the U.S. face are not necessarily, in terms of energy, the ones that Israel faces in dealing with Iran. There is a different set of strategic priorities, and there is a different set of areas of U.S. commitment, and I've listed the key ones here. And there are U.S. plans and solutions to deal with these, but I'm going to talk more about changes than I am about policy or trends. And let me make a few points about energy. I have sat through politicians since the Carter administration that talked about reducing U.S. strategic dependence on energy imports. Each of them has basically made a political statement which had no substance whatsoever in reality. And the Obama administration will be no exception. The projections you see on these charts are from the Department of Energy and the Energy Information Agency. It is mandated to take all congressional and all administration policies seriously. Those of us who model this know perfectly well that many of these policies can never be implemented. But the reality is that in terms of liquids and in terms of natural gas, as far as we can model into the future, dependence will not be reduced in any way. And we are not tied to American imports. We are tied to a global economy. And the global economy has to have energy exports. This is often a problem because people look at U.S. import dependence. It is strategically irrelevant to the broader issue of how we have to operate in a global economy. Now, this is a projection from the International Energy Agency, and what is striking about it is that it too shows just about the same set of conclusions. I should note here that there are many studies of energy. Anybody with an envelope and a hand calculator can claim to have a model of energy. There are probably 3 semi-public models and 3 national models which are not public, and 1 oil company model that matter. Out of these, only 1 model is transparent. That's the model done by the Department of Energy. It is the only model that is footnoted, explains its assumptions, explains the model, and is publicly available. But the International Energy Agency provides roughly the same conclusions. It is basically that dependence does not change, not in any strategically relevant way. What does change is the nature of energy. These are the various bars showing which countries have the most reserves. What's striking about this particular chart, and the reason I put it up there, is it takes into account Venezuelan heavy oil and Canadian tar sands. Why is that relevant? Because by standard projections of energy resources, the Gulf wouldn't have 60% of the world's proven oil reserves. It would have something on the order of 67%. Now let me say something for those of you who are students. There are no meaningful, reliable estimates in the unclassified world of oil reserves. Why? Because oil reserves are dependent on price, they're dependent on highly detailed and very, very classified estimates of field performance. Sometimes this leak, but companies don't want it public and countries do not want it public. And the figures that people use for public consumption, both in this, which is taken from the Department of Energy, and in the International Energy Agency, are unique. It is only energy reserves which say they come from a magazine, Oil and Gas Journal. And that is because no government publishes an actual estimate of energy reserves as an unclassified document. What is striking about these reserves, however, is that if you look at the bars in these charts, after a period from 73 to the present, there has been no meaningful reduction in global dependence on Gulf oil reserves at anything approaching a commercial price. If you raise the price to the highest possible estimates, the reserves change. And let me note something. If you want to know how silly some of these estimates are, for example, for Iraq, people have been using 115 billion barrels for decades. Well, because the reserve estimate is dependent on the price of oil, it should vary almost by the month, if not the day. If it doesn't, you can't trust the estimate. But what is the key transition here? There are two, and they really affect energy security and energy supply. One is, can you get significant, efficient production out of Iran and Iraq? In terms of political stability, in terms of investment in basic technology, the last years that you really had stable energy development and investment in Iran and Iraq, which are two of the highest bars on this chart, were between 1978 and 1981. That was before three-dimensional seismic and most modern technologies for oil field development and production and exploration had been known and ever applied. So what we are talking about is two very major countries which have almost been set aside from efficient energy production for close to 30 years. Whenever you hear about running out of oil, about Gulf estimates, and about Gulf flows, remember, the key transition here will ultimately be, when do these countries come online and with what efficiency? The other key transition here is basic economics. The day that you got cheap oil in terms of low technology production, you opened up the well and at a cost of perhaps $3 a barrel, it flowed forever, have been over for nearly a decade. Field development today is a high investment, high capital, high technology effort. Out of the countries on this chart for the Middle East, you have exactly two countries that have highly efficient energy sectors and highly efficient energy technology: Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Two are very inefficient for political and internal reasons: the UAE and the area of Kuwait. Kuwait has been waiting since before the Iraqi invasion to have an efficient oil company. You have similar but lesser problems in Libya, where it is moving toward more modern technology. You have a relatively efficient but often frozen and undercapitalized sector in Algeria. Now let me note, one of the key issues here is not simply when does the technology move into these countries, how efficient is it, when do you actually get large-scale field development, and that includes things like very complex three-dimensional drilling. It is also money. The capital costs of increasing and sustaining production are absolutely immense, and they are growing very, very sharply, and they will grow steadily in real terms indefinitely into the future. So when people talk about Gulf economies in terms of oil export revenues, it is quite frankly not the way to measure vulnerability or to measure what is happening. Revenues have to be compared to the cost of field development. So one of the key studies, for example, from the International Energy Agency this year will be to update its estimates of the cost of energy development. And it is not clear in today's climate that countries are maintaining anything like the investment level required to reach their production goals. This is also obviously a matter of talent. There's another thing I should mention in passing here. people talk about oil-rich countries. Well, the problem is oil-rich is relative to population. So when you look at this chart, Qatar is arguably the highest per capita income in the world. Iraq is 162nd, which means its per capita income is roughly equivalent to that of Gaza. Iran is at something like 54th. Saudi Arabia is at something like 34th because they have very high populations. These are, and I think Professor Lewis made the point yesterday, countries which export virtually nothing else. Their economies depend on one thing, oil, gas, and product. And the politics and the stability depends on whether they can basically either make a transition to high levels of employment and sustain social structures, or they get enough revenues to substitute. And let me note another aspect of the chart you see here. There is virtually nothing that creates fewer real jobs than a mature oil or natural gas field. In countries with very high populations, with very high growth and very young populations, oil and gas do not provide jobs, not unless they're artificial and they have no social or economic output. Now, within this flow, yes, the Middle East's importance in world energy exports is roughly the same as it was in 1973. In terms of oil revenues, there is a danger here of assuming that they're going to rise forever or they're going to drop forever. In fact, you can see in the course of just the last year, what began as an economic crisis in late 2008 has virtually begun to reverse itself in constant revenues. But one of the most interesting aspects is that the U.S. Department of Energy will not provide an estimate for next year. We simply don't know. Prices are too volatile. The economic structures and the economic flows cannot, in any credible sense, be predicted. Now, let me note for those of you who are students, you can still make a vast amount of money as a consultant producing absolute statistical rubbish as long as the people who get it don't understand what you're saying. But you cannot, in any academically valid way, or for that matter, commercial way, produce a valid production. Incidentally, just so you know, these are in constant prices as well as current prices, and this is done by the Department of Energy, and it is a declassified estimate. Now, putting that in background, since we don't know oil prices and we try to figure out what the impact will be on world dependence, we model a range of prices. That range has never been higher than it is this year. The disparity between the low and the high price estimate is twice what it was last year. That volatility and unpredictability is one of the key aspects of this region in transition. It also affects our consumption of prices. Remember what I said about energy dependence? Okay, we've had now, since the Carter administration, one promise after another. Unless prices basically skyrocket on a sustained basis, this is U.S. dependence, and we remain dependent on imports through 2030. Let me say that there has never been an estimate from the United States government done by the Department of Energy dependence which has ever tracked in any way possible to the promises of various politicians. Now, I'm sure in Israel all politicians keep every promise, but just as a caution, that doesn't always happen in the United States. Unconventional oil, let me note the problem that you see here. Under the best conceivable case, if what you want is unconventional oil, you would by 2030 get things to about 17% of global supply. The problem is this is an environmental disaster. If you look at that, the largest bar is still biofuels. Unless there is a massive breakthrough in technology to cellulose conversion, the impact of that on food and the environment would be catastrophic. If you look at the others, they are heavy oil, shale oil, things which directly impact on aquifers and the environment in ways which are almost completely negative. So the whole idea that alternative fuels somehow are environmentally green and benign relative to oil is something which you cannot conceivably put into an analysis with any credible data. And the other thing to remember here is that when people talk about reducing dependence on oil, they almost always are talking about one aspect, which is electricity generation. They are not talking about the transportation sector. So for the world to move, you have to use liquids. And if you don't look at this by sector, you are not looking at the problems of transition. What's the critical transition here? It is the incredible rate of increase in Asian vehicles using basically relatively high consumptions of ordinary petroleum fuels. And all of this is documented in more detail in the longer presentation, which is up on the web. Now, let me also make a few quick points about vulnerability. I don't have time to get into the details, but I read time and again things about closing the Straits of Hormuz. That is a relatively simple military problem to solve. It is not a serious risk. It is something which would be an unpleasant week to 10 days. But the fact is that given the size of U.S. capabilities, it is not a challenge Iran can propose or pose in the Gulf. The problem is very different when we look at the overall structure of offshore and onshore facilities. You don't break a bottle at the neck, you can break a bottle anywhere. What Iran has done is create small dispersed facilities for its naval guards, create land-based anti-ship missile facilities on channels in the Gulf, create capabilities to attack offshore facilities and coastal facilities using a variety of different asymmetric means. So this is the model of vulnerability, not the Strait of Hormuz. And this gives you a picture of the kinds of difficulties simply in defining the zones in the Gulf and who controls what area. And yes, there are alternatives. The problem is that every single pipeline that does not go through the Strait of Hormuz is already being operated to capacity or is not operable. The only plans that you have to create new pipelines would be gas pipelines along the Gulf and a pipeline that goes to the Gulf of Oman. Unfortunately, when we look at that pipeline that would go to the Indian Ocean, the vulnerability studies show it doesn't do us any good. It is too much within the range of Iranian attack capabilities, so it would be a very interesting and expensive alternative, but it doesn't solve the problem of energy vulnerability. There's one other issue I want to raise here. This is, in another sense, one of the most vulnerable areas in the world. Why? Because every one of the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, are dependent on desalination plants in the Gulf for their water, and they are dependent on electricity for the function of that country. There is no grid. There is no netting of these capabilities. If anyone is threatened or taken out, there is no alternative or option. And for cost reasons, they are extremely centralized, and very little effort has been made to deal with vulnerability. Now, a couple of quick points about Iran. And I'm not going to give you the details, they're all in the presentation. Iran leads the rest of the Gulf in one thing, which is manpower, which is generally useless, because unless it is intending to invade Iraq, it doesn't have the capability to project power. It is a static, defensive ground force with very little organized mobility. And as a result, when you start looking at other things which are technology, this is the ratio simply of Gulf Cooperation Council countries spending to Iran. Over a period of a decade, the Gulf Cooperation Council alone, ignoring the United States, has spent 7 times as much on modern weapons and technology, and those dollars are worth far more than an Iranian dollar because those countries can get the most modern and effective technology, and Iran is often restricted to buying what might be described as military rubbish. When you look at this in terms of arms orders, you get an even clearer picture. The ratio is something like 13 to 1, again in dollar value. When you look at modern tank strength, the truth of the matter is Saudi Arabia alone has nearly the same number of tanks and far more modern tanks. In addition, it has access to these U.S. assets. And I haven't shown you the U.S. assets on these charts, but an era where precision weapons, situational awareness, what we call IS&R, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and battle management dominates combat, the United States brings assets to an Iran which is still dependent on systems that it bought during the time of the Shah that Iran cannot conceivably match. The same is true in aircraft. General Petraeus somewhat, I think, optimistically said about a week ago that the UAE Air Force alone could knock out the Iranian Air Force. I don't think that's true. It would probably take the Saudi and the UAE Air Force. If it was the United States Air Force and Navy, this is not a serious force. You're talking about F-4s, F-14s, crude early models of the MiG-29A and Su-24. There is not a modern combat aircraft in the Iranian Air Force. And as for their land-based air defenses, they have one modern short-range system. When it comes down to the Iranian surface-to-air missiles, in terms of technology years, they are older than anyone in this room. And indeed, the bulk of their forces are dependent on systems that I dealt with in Vietnam. They're that old. They date back to the late 1960s. A failure to look at technology, to look at netting, to look at age of weapon systems leads to people talking about Iran as a hegemon. It is time, I think, that we got a little more serious about military analysis. The figures are radically different when we talk about asymmetric warfare. And I'm not going to impinge on the time of my colleagues to go through all of this. It's in the briefing. What I do want to say is Iran lies systematically about its military exercises. It grossly exaggerates their scope and the number of people involved, and it gets printed again and again as if what they were saying was right. It isn't. What they are very good at, however, is modeling different types of asymmetric warfare using mines, using precision-guided anti-ship weapons, looking at small craft equipped with systems or people trained to attack offshore targets or to raid the coastal Gulf targets. You can fight wars of attrition. You don't need to close the Gulf. You can do things like reduce, or as Iraq did earlier, you simply can release a large oil slick, and the currents in the Gulf take it around toward the desalination plants along the coast. You can release free-floating mines, and they can be released off any ship, including the dhows that move regularly through the UAE. If you have a slow war of attrition, you get what is called a tanker premium. You intimidate your neighbors, you pressure your neighbors, but you don't necessarily have a war large enough to provoke a massive military response. And there is variation after variation on this theme. One problem we have is that people who write about this in the unclassified literature look at not only the worst case, but often the case that can't happen, and do not look at what Iran actually exercises and trains to do. Now, this is a range of things known all too well in Israel in terms of Iranian action. We do face another classic energy problem. This country basically went bankrupt in 1982. It stopped serious energy production and development in 1981. Effort after effort since 2003 to modernize and look at the fields in a scientific way was not actually carried out. There was a survey by a Dutch company called Seybold, which was really a back-of-the-envelope guess. It is a country which is not torn apart by the kind of civil war that paralyzed it earlier, but it is divided. It is very vulnerable, and it is violent. The Chinese concession, which is the one operating concession in Iran, has had very serious security problems. A week after the contracts were issued in the latest contract offer, there was an attack on the pipelines. Companies do not send technology and people into Iran when they're vulnerable. And there is still a very high level of attack. And I'm sorry that graph came through earlier, but didn't come through this time. So let me just say what's happening. What we have is a constant level of serious violence in Iran, which is far lower than it was in 2006, in Iraq. But what you have to understand is, until the last 3 months, the level of violence inside Iraq was higher than the level of violence inside the war in Afghanistan. Going way down from the peak in 2006 through early 2008 does not mean that violence is over. Other problems that we have. That shows you the chart. This shows you the causes. There's a breakout in the presentation. Looking at the mapping of high-profile attacks does not show you problems with infrastructure or problems with investment. This is still a serious security issue, and it will be a serious security issue for at least several years after the U.S. withdraws. And if you're wondering, we are withdrawing. It isn't just a matter of troops. We're moving massive amounts of equipment out of Iraq to places like Afghanistan before the troop reductions take place. We are already closing bases and major facilities. Once you do that, going back is completely different. It isn't a matter of simply moving troops. It is a massive exercise at a time you're fighting in Afghanistan. Why do I bring up Somalia? Because it has not been a major risk to energy as yet. And this chart is hard to understand. Again, I'm giving you something that's in a much more detailed presentation. What was striking about Somalia? In less than a year, they went from extremely inefficient strikes on traffic near the coast to the use of mothership, small craft, more advanced boarding techniques, and more advanced weapons. We have no idea what's going to happen in Somalia politically over the next 10 years, but it seems extremely unlikely that what is going to happen will be pleasant. And as a potential facility and base, it is a potential threat to energy which extends far beyond the Gulf and Iran. We run into roughly the same problems with al-Qaeda in the peninsula, which has been shifted in large part to operations in Yemen, but still, for all the Saudi claims, is a serious problem in Saudi Arabia. But it is Yemen which probably presents as serious a problem as any. I would say that it would be a challenge of impossible proportions to figure out a happy ending for what is happening in Yemen right now. Given population growth, given water, given insurgency, given unemployment, given the lack of government institutions and structure, given the lack of basic competence and capacity in government, And you have to remember that if it doesn't matter who's ruling the state, because there is no one in the state who can govern, this is a warning about what is very likely to be a serious problem in terms of either continuing disorder or at some point in the future an Islamist state. And its geography, unfortunately, is fairly clear. This also, I think, brings us up to the broader challenge of terrorism. When you look at that, please remember that the first serious terrorist or indirect attack on oil was when Libya released mines in the Red Sea outside the Suez Canal decades ago. So when you talk about instability, it is not simply the Gulf or Iran. It is what happens in Eritrea. It is what happens in the Sudan. It is what will Egypt's stability be over the next 10 years in the transition out of Mubarak, because it is the flow out and through the Suez Canal and the pipeline near it, which is equally critical. You also have the problem that as you move further and further to the east, you have challenges and differences between India and China, as well as a different kind of piracy. Now, let me just say a few things about missile warfare. This is today a largely theoretical threat. I will not tell anyone here that it is a pleasant thing to have a 300-pound high-explosive warhead land in the suburbs. But I'm also going to say that, frankly, it is scarcely the end of the world. Conventional warheads from missiles that do not have terminal homing, with very limited explosive capability, are terror weapons which in the real world you either defend against or you can ignore. And the ranges shown here are purely theoretical. They assume that they all have a 1,000-kilogram warhead. The chances that any given missile has an exactly 1,000-kilogram warhead in the real world are roughly equivalent to a snowball in hell. In short, you are watching missile ranges which have absolutely no relation to the real-world nature of the warhead on them. And if you want to know when you're reading journalistic rubbish, it's easy. They describe the missile range, but not the payload and the nature of the warhead. Unfortunately, that's where all of these curves and all of the unclassified data come from. And they often use CEPs, which are not a measure of accuracy or reliability. Now, yes, there can be missile wars here, but as long as those warheads are conventional, the damage they can do is essentially intimidation, it is terror, it is limiting conventional reprisals against Iran, it is not something which can destroy facilities. When you do calculations, you could fire something like 20 Shahabs into the Ras Tanura area and not, without a guided or terminal warhead, do significant damage to that one facility. These are things to remember because missiles have become almost a cult in terms of focusing on one military dimension rather than the overall threat. And yes, people are buying missile defenses, not particularly well integrated defenses. There is no common concept as yet. People are not listening to what is happening. So let me just conclude very briefly with a few points that focus on something of a little more interest to Israel, but which affects the Gulf states and all of Iran's neighbors. If this was the real map of the world, you would probably have much less concern about the feasibility of an Israeli strike. But all this are the major facilities which get into the press. It doesn't show you the other 64 areas where we know from unclassified literature Iran has some form of nuclear activity. It doesn't show you that part of their centrifuge plants are actually in Mashhad, the far northeastern corner, of Iran. You're talking about an immense target array. Initially, if you only had the P1 centrifuge, you also might say they needed large-scale underground facilities. But they are now up to the P4. We do not know its capacity. Again, you can disregard what is read or said in the press. What we do know is this. It is now far easier for Iran to create very large numbers of dispersed, cheap surface facilities with what we call folded centrifuges. This means that when you really conduct an effective strike over Iran, you have to be able to target, you have to have real-time satellite capabilities for damage assessment of an extraordinarily advanced level. I will leave it to those of you who know Israeli capabilities as to whether you have that capability. It also means you have to be able to restrike and suppress. And it takes 3 to 7 days to do a simple damage assessment of a known facility. It takes months to figure out the pattern of how they react. And since I am doing my best to cheer you up, if you've wondered what some of these facilities are like, this is roughly equivalent to the underground parking garage here at the university. This is the entrance to that large underground facility you keep hearing about with the centrifuges. This is what it looked like when they finished it. It's roughly the equivalent of one large building that could be any building anywhere. This is what it looks like from the road. This isn't paranoia. This isn't Iraq. There isn't some immense security barrier around this system. This is a very well-concealed facility. If you went to more modern centrifuge technology, you wouldn't have to go underground, and you could use a significant number of small centrifuges anywhere. And just in conclusion, one point I do want to make, Israel is indeed vulnerable existentially. So is Iran. If you take out this number of targets with one thermonuclear weapon each, Iran does not recover as a nation. Its Persian identity, its culture, and its economy is destroyed. If you look at the greater Tehran area and you put down 4 thermonuclear weapons on Tehran, the core structure of about 11% of the country's population goes down, and with it about 40% of its economy. And that is direct burst hits. It ignores the problem of fallout, which has lethal ranges at 30, 50, and sometimes 100 miles. I guess one last point, if I may. Remember the issue of time here. I've talked about nuclear. Iran is a declared chemical weapons state. Crude unitary chemical weapons on a warhead are not effective. Cluster chemical weapons are a different story. If you want to know what it takes to dispense a cluster chemical or biological weapon, when you go back and you have a car tonight, look at the steering wheel. The Tally Corporation, which developed the airbag, which is now used in every vehicle in the world, developed the airbag originally to disperse cluster munitions. And that is how secret the technology is. The other problem is simply biological. Whatever we do to suppress any country's nuclear capabilities, there is no country in this region with a significant industrial base that will not be capable of genetically engineering biological weapons in the next 5 to 10 years. The whole idea of weapons of mass destruction-free zones, or that you secure yourself against these weapons or against terrorist weapon use of these weapons by nuclear means, is an idea which simply is fading out of reality. And I think, in all fairness, and as somebody who has been an advocate of the Biological Weapons Convention, I have to agree with the Obama administration. The review we completed about 2 months ago of enforcement regimes for biological weapons concluded we simply cannot do it. There is no technical basis for having any kind of meaningful inspection and control regime. And some of the things which used to be controlled even 5 years ago on the Australia list are now sold by universities without control on eBay, which gives you an idea of the world we are beginning to live in. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Professor Cordesman, thank you very much. Not everything you said was optimistic, but I think the realism was certainly important, and it's the basis of further activity. Our next speaker is Dr. Amos Nadan. Dr. Nadan holds a PhD from the London School of Economics. He is a senior research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. His field of specialization is economic history and political economies of the Middle East, and his recent book is The Palestinian Peasant Economy Under the Mandate, the story of colonial bungling and his lecture today will be Economic Sanctions and the Middle East, Theory and Reality.
I'll try to do that short. This is the title, as Reuven just mentioned. As you probably noticed in the invitation, we speak about the Middle East in transition, and there was also a picture of a Czech board, like a real art of playing a war game. As far as economic sanctions are concerned, I argue that it's more simple than it looks like. And I'll go into detail about the theory and about the practice with a relation to the Middle East, and I think that I'll be more clear at that time. Speaking about economic sanction, we speak about the aim of economic sanction is, first of all, to change the behavior of a receiver. A receiver, for example, Iran, in the recent case, meaning the target. The idea is to cause economic deterioration for that target or to intimidate with economic deterioration, meaning that the receiver would fear from the sanction. The idea is, when you run a sanction, is to create a sanction to cause internal pressure, and from that internal pressure, a change of behavior would occur. This is, from time to time, you can see is very problematic, because the intention is to change, to cause, in fact, pressure on the leadership to change the behavior, but for sometimes you can see that the opposite occur. For example, if you go to the case of the Palestinians, the Israel sanction on Arafat, the idea was, in fact, to create tension in order to reduce the attack of Arafat on Israel. The result was that the Palestinians said, no, okay, the Israelis understand force, let's bring the Hamas. So it's not always so simple, but at least the theoretical issue is sanction, internal pressure, and change of behavior. There are also indirect receivers, and we need to remember them. One of them is the sender country, but by itself. Sender, meaning the one that imposed the sanction. Saying we are doing something. Okay? It's for the people of the country. If there is a need, or at least a pledge for a attack or to do something against a country, it's a good idea to participate or to intimidate with the economic sanction, and that would in fact serve the people of your own country, not necessarily would create the necessary or requested change of behavior. There is also the international one, the international receivers, where you say to a country that participated to a sanction or that started the sanction, we are with you, we are responsible, and so on. Precondition for sanction to succeed is significant economic influence of sender on a receiver. For example, if the US would run sanctions against Israel, that would be very problematic to Israel, because Israel depended on the US to a significant degree. If the opposite would occur, meaning if Israel would start economic sanction on the USA, nothing serious would occur to the USA. Therefore, if Israel would run economic sanction on the USA, probably at least from the economic point of view, the chance to create a change of behavior is nearly nothing. Method. We speak about many methods for economic sanction, but specifically we speak about trade barriers, we speak about other attacks or attempts to attacks on the financial issue, investment constraint, and so on. But mainly, we speak today about trade barriers. Okay. If we go to issues that under the spotlight today, we can speak about the case of, let's start with Iraq. Iraq, as you probably remember, in 1991, after the invasion to Kuwait, there was announcements on economic sanction, and the target was go out of Kuwait. Iraq didn't do that. Later on, sanctions continue because of the attempt, in fact, or the argument that there is the weapon of mass destruction. There's also part of that is that people didn't want to see Saddam Hussein there. But at the end of the day, it's also a failure. And I'm calling a failure for a case that the sanction didn't manage to cause change in behavior, namely that afterward came a real war or just announcement of failure. In the case of Iraq, two failures because you didn't need economic sanction if you decided to go into a war. Iran, I think that, at least as we see that today, it's also a failure. Already in 2007, by the way, a note, Eldad Pardo from the Truman Institute and myself, we wrote a short essay, and pro-academic essay, and we said that if it doesn't work in a few months, it will not work. Until now, we're right. Let's hope that we are wrong, but it seems that we're right. Also, in the Palestinian Authority, I've just mentioned that in fact, the attempts to create change of behavior in the Palestinian Authority headed by Yasser Arafat to create a change, it didn't work as well. If we leave the things that are now on the spotlight and go to cases that are less familiar or kind of ancient, if we speak about economic sanction, you can go and see, for example, from many cases in that book, Economic Sanction Reconsidered. And I want just to speak about sanctions that the Arab League run against three entities. The first one is the Arab League against Israel. In fact, it started in Mandate Palestine. 46 is the official one. It started, in fact, in 1945. And the idea was, in fact, to try not to establish a Jewish state, or more than that, during the mandate period, to make sure that these people are going back to their homeland, namely not to Palestine according to that view. It continued later on. Officially, it continued until today, but not on the same level. If you speak about the bottom line is failure. As you probably know, Israel still exists and the Jews live here. The Arab League versus Egypt, another example of a sanction. The Arab League, in fact, started or announced economic sanction against Egypt following the negotiation and more than that, the signing of the agreement between Israel and Egypt. the peace agreement, and the idea was, hey guys, stop the relation with Israel, otherwise we would continue sanctioning you. The bottom line is, of course, that you know that things continue, but here it's something very interesting. If we speak about the first one, Arab League versus Israel, where the target was indeed too big, meaning huge, commit suicide, or we would run economic sanction, here you can also try, in fact, to measure and to see whether there were some different incentives. If you take the economic, at least, analysis of this case, the Arab League got more from the USA and from the relation with Israel than they got from, Egypt got more from Israel and the USA than it got from the Arab League. So, in fact, the alternative was not such a good alternative to divert into the Arab League, but still, as you probably understand, it's more complicated than just speaking about economics, moving from peace agreement supported by the USA, then to say we are not there. In the Cold War, it wasn't such a wise thing to do, and in fact, Egypt chose not to surrender to that sanction. The last sanction, which is the Arab League versus Canada, this is a story of success. You're probably not familiar with that. But this is a story that occurred in 1979. And in 1979, following the agreement, Canada announced that Israel, following the request of Israel, Canada is about to move from the embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They didn't do that. Because then the Arab League, and in fact, different Arab states, started to say, hey guys, do you remember that you are not on the list for our ban or relations related to the oil crisis? You will be there. Do you remember that we said that we would invest in such and such companies? We would not do that, and so on and so forth. It takes a week or so to the Canadian government to say, oops, sorry, mistake, we're not going to do that. And in fact, this is a case of success, meaning the Arab League managed to convince by economic sanction, but think about the target. The target was very, very small. Think about the sanction. The sanctions were not implemented. It was just in the case of intimidation, saying we would do that, that they stopped from running their attempt or the will to move the embassy. I think that if we speak about better chances for success, it's not that I'm supporting economic sanction, but I'm saying that if someone wants to run economic sanction, he needs from the beginning to know the success, the chances. Small targets. And small targets is, first of all, in the receiver's view, meaning that you can think, or I can think, that it's not a problem not to have military, how do you say it? Atomic weapon for a state, but it might be that Iran thinks differently. So what you have to do is, in fact, to analyze the view of the receiver to understand if it's small or big target. Comparatively significant pressure or intimidation, meaning that you would have the power to impose that and to go from the beginning with full scale. If you go stage after stage after stage, in fact, you create a situation that you have a stage, you wait a few months, and then the receiver finds alternatives. So if you want, in fact, to use the full power of economic sanction, use them from the beginning. Otherwise, you don't use them in a wise way, and you would get eventually, you would go to a decision where you have to decide whether you say, okay, I'm quit, we failed, or use other method, and this is, of course, something that relates to the government decisions. No significant alternatives. Speaking about coalitions are good at the beginning, if they are good at all. But usually, while speaking about alternatives, today, in the global market, there are many alternatives. And this is why, in fact, we need to remember also that coalitions are related to time. Meaning, if a big coalition starts economic sanction, it's not necessarily that this coalition will continue after a year. We remember the case of Iraq, of people not willing to participate at the beginning and later on to say we are out, while the disasters came out in the news. For example, children who died because they didn't get supply of medicine. Time. The longer the time, the more the alternatives. And this, in fact, comes against the view that, okay, if you will wait enough time, you'll get the sanction would succeed. No, there are too many alternatives. The longer the time, the less efficient the sanction. Gradual sanctions, as I just said, are less effective. And I think that if there is a major message here is that if it didn't work in a short time, it will not work. Most probably it will not work. That takes you to a situation when you can think about many sanctions that are running today, and you say, okay, probably this is the direction. If a sanction run from 2006 or other sanction from 2000, and they are not working on the way that you hope that they will work, probably they will not. Still, they are working on two different audiences than the receivers. They are working in the international community saying we are doing something, and they are working in the internal community, again, saying we are doing something. But the chances for success are very, very limited, if at all. Thank you.
Prior to the examination of the impact of the global economic crisis on the GCC economies, a few words are needed on the global economic situation prior to the crisis. Here we can see that overall during the 3 years prior to the onset of the crisis, the global economic growth rate was quite impressive, with GDP real growth rate amounting to 3.4% in 2005, 3.9% in 2006, and 3.7% in 2007, namely about twice the population growth rate during the corresponding period. The highest growth rate one can see was in East and Southeast Asia, which their GDP growth rate was very high. Related to the Arab countries, in the Arab regime, particularly in the GCC oil economies, the major factor for the rapid economic expansion from 2002 until July or maybe even August 2008 was the sharp rise in oil revenues, driven by both increasing production scale as well as steady surge in oil prices. In 2008, the oil production of the GCC countries skyrocketed to about 16.4 million BD, barrel per day, representing an increase of about 7% from the previous year. Here in this table, we can see that the surge in oil revenue accelerated during the first 8 months of 2008, when oil prices peaked at $147 per barrel in July 2008. The GCC oil revenues amounted to more than $500 billion in 2008, compared to about $300 billion in 2007 and about $137 billion in 2003. And here you can see on this table, this is the OPEC basket price from 1996 and until December. This is the last day of December of 2009. You can see the skyrocket of the prices. Overall, here, that's the OPEC reference basket price since 1996, and we can see the peak of 2008. And this is 2000. This is the whole story, I think. This is the prices, the monthly average prices in 2008. You can see the increase in the mid of the year, and then the decrease after the beginning of the crisis. In addition to the surge in oil prices, there was a boom in the construction, banking, and of course the tourism sector. During 2003-2008, the GDP economy as a whole, almost tripled its size until 2008, with a current account surplus of about $300 billion The per capita income in Qatar, the largest world exporter of natural gas, was the world's highest in 2008, second only to Luxembourg. In the United Arab Emirates as well, the per capita GDP more than doubled during the period of 2003-2008. This economic expansion in the GCC was accompanied by a rapid increase in the number of foreign workers, which amounted to 10.7 million in mid-2008 compared to 7.1 million in 1999, namely an increase of almost 50% in less than a decade. Hence, the economic situation in the Gulf period to the worldwide crisis was excellent, and all of the projections indicate the continuation of high rapid economic expansion in the foreseeable future as well. In late February 2008, Joseph Ackerman, the chairman of the International Financial Institute and the chairman of the board of the Deutsche Bank, said as follows: "It is unlikely that the Gulf economies be affected in the events that the US economy slip into recession." The ESCWA, the UN Economic Commission for Western Asia, in its the annual socioeconomic report published in June 2008, almost a year after the onset of the crisis in the US, says as follows: "Average growth of about 5.6% is expected over the next 3 years. Oil prices are expected to remain buoyant, leading to high level of investment." And here, of course, a report of the Gulf Finance House published in late July 2008 noted that the strong economic and investment boom in the GCC region will also continue a path for the medium term, with oil prices expected to remain in triple digit, okay, for the remainder of 2008, and several major capacity expansion in the pipeline across oil and non-oil sector. The GCC states remain firmly on a secure from the storm. Well, these are only a few examples of many who almost without an exception predicted the continuation of rapid economic expansion in the GCC region for the foreseeable future, despite the global crisis. All of these, of course, optimistic forecasts, however, suddenly evaporated in late September and early October 2008, following the drop in oil prices, which are accompanied by the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the United States. The subprime crisis turned into a global economic recession, which began to hit the GCC economies as well. The huge financial volatility that was characterized the Gulf since 2003 evaporated almost immediately, and it was replaced by a gloomy economic atmosphere. The GCC authorities are caught unprepared for the crisis. Overall, the most devastating results of the global economic crisis for the GCC economies were as follows. The first is decline in oil prices. As we saw, according to current estimates, the GCC oil revenues in 2009 will amount to approximately $300 billion, namely about 40% less than in 2008. The second effect, of course, is decline in prices of raw materials. Thus, for example, SABIC, the Saudi Arabian Basic Industries, had net loss of $260 million during the first quarter of 2009. It was the first quarterly loss in 7 years. The sharp decline in SABIC profits was the result of the severe drop of production scale due to the halt in the automobile and electronic industries worldwide. RAK Steel, the Ras Al Khaimah Steel, stopped production in September and October 2008 because the huge decline in the demand for steel. The second, of course, the sharp decline even in the tourism activities. About Dubai, I will say a few words later if the time, of course, will allow to be. But I'm coming from the north of Israel, so maybe I can get another 2 minutes, I hope. In any case, the tourism activity, which is very important in some countries like Bahrain, of course, Dubai, the marked decline, of course, affected their economic performance. Of course, the cancellation of many mega projects from the onset of the crisis in the Gulf and until April 2009, an estimated $364 billion worth of projects have been cancelled only in United Arab Emirates. In the other GCC countries as well, many projects have been totally cancelled or put on hold. And of course, the last one, which is very important, an increase in employment pressure. Although the first to suffer from the declining economic activities in the GCC countries are, of course, the foreign labor. The crisis, however, affected the national workforce as well, as the overall number of job opportunities in the private sector substantially declined. It should be noted, however, that despite the worsening of the employment situation, nationals still do not want to work in many private sector occupations. Hence, for example, in the building site or construction and so on. Hence, despite the recession, the rentier mentality is still kicking and alive. Although the core of the lecture concentrates on the GCC economies, the recession in the Gulf directly affected the non-oil Arab economies in three major areas. The first is the decline of workers' remittances. Since the October 73 oil boom, workers' remittances constitute a major contributor to the economy of the non-oil Arab countries. In 2007, workers' remittance constitute 80% of the Jordanian GDP, 29% in Lebanon, and about 20% in the Palestinian occupied territories. By 2008, the workers' remittances to Jordan amounted to $3.4 billion. Although the cancellation of mega projects in the GCC are mainly in the construction sector, in which Arab foreign labor represent only a minor percentage of the total employees, their share in the related industries and services such as banking, insurance, and so on are considerable. The decline of both employment opportunities and salaries led to a marked reduction in the workers' remittances. In the case of Jordan, the workers' remittances declined from a peak of 625 million Jordanian dinar in the third quarter of 2008 to about 500 million GD in the first quarter of 2009. In the case of Egypt, the scale of the workers' remittances declined from the peak of $4.4 billion in 2007-2008 fiscal year to $4.2 billion in the 2008-2009 fiscal year. The second effect is, of course, the number of work opportunities. As we said, the unemployment problem in Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and so on are all already severe. So the decline, the number of job opportunities for Arab labor in the Gulf, of course, only exacerbate this problem, which remains very high in double-digit figures. And the last one is the scale of the FDI, the foreign direct investment of the GCC in the non-oil Arab countries. Overall, North Africa's year-round sunshine and proximity to Europe made it a favorable destination for GCC investors, mainly in the tourism area. The decline in worldwide tourism activities since early 2008 on the one hand, and the developers' problem, the GCC, of course, development problems in their project in the Gulf itself on the other, led to a cancellation or even stoppage of most of their projects outside the Gulf. Currently, billions of dollars worth of contracts planned by Gulf developers in Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan are put on hold, and in many cases probably never will be implemented. And we can see what's happened. This is 2008, of course, GDP growth rate, and this is ESCWA figure and IMF forecast for 2009, and we can see the sharp decline. The second, the next thing I want to say that although the GDP growth rate in the non-oil Arab countries, in both in 2009 and probably also in 2010, are expected to be much lower compared to previous year, they are still positive, although not in per capita terms, because of course, their rapid population growth. How the GCC authority dealing with the consequence of the crisis? Thus far, the four major tools are as follows. First, increase financial incentives to the private employers for increasing the number of national employees. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it was decided in April 2009 that from from now on, the Human Resources Development Fund would pay half of the first annual salary of Saudis who are newly hired by private firms in advance. It had previously paid the 50% at the end of the year. The aim, of course, was to tempt the companies to increase the number of national employees, as getting credit in the banks become more difficult since the onset of the crisis. This is the first tool. The second, of course, is implementing an expansionary fiscal policy through raising the budget for infrastructure development such as electricity, water desalination, and of course tourism facilities. The two aims of this expansionary policy are to maintain economic activity level and to better prepare the economies for the day after the crisis. In the case of Qatar, for example, the 2009-2010 budget is expected to be the largest ever. Also, the Saudi Arabia capital spending for 2009 and 2010 is projected to be much higher than in 2008. A leading transportation project financed by the Saudi government is the 7 billion railway linking Dammam and Jeddah through the capital Riyadh, as we can see here. This is only one example. The third tool, of course, stabilization of the financial sector. The GCC authorities, without exception, have adopted extraordinary measures in order to restore confidence and stabilize the financial sector, mainly by deposit guarantees and injection capital in order to encourage banks to lend more to the private sector. In the case of Saudi Arabia, for example, the government deposited $8 billion in local banks during the October 8, March 9 period. This is the same policy was acted by the United Arab Emirates government as well as Kuwait and Qatar. And of course, the last one is increasing oil production spare capacity. This has mainly been carried out by Saudi Arabia for two main reasons, as I see it. First, to maintain relatively moderate oil prices as a major tool for the recovery of the global economy. And the second aim, which I see that the most important, is to maintain the long-term demand for oil at the expense of alternative energy sources. And of course, as a major tool to finance the governmental activities. However, while in the worldwide developed economies, an increased budget is financed by an increasing deficit up to 9% of GDP. In the GCC countries, the increased budget expenditure are financed by governmental reserve and foreign assets. So they continue with this policy at least for the next maybe 2 years at least. According to recent ESCWA projection, the GDP growth rate of the GCC countries in 2009 would average 1.1%, still higher than in most developed countries worldwide, but again, it's a negative in per capita terms. Qatar, of course, is an exceptionary, and its GDP growth rate in 2009 is much higher because it's major natural gas exporter. Dubai is a totally different. Prior to the first exporter of oil in Dubai, the economies of the Emirates, including Dubai, was dominated by pearl production, fishing, harding, and of course trade, traditional Gulf economy. Since the October 73 oil boom, the oil sector became the dominant driving force of the Emirates economy. However, even in those days of the bonanza oil period of the 70s and the first half of the 80s, Dubai's authorities were pioneer among all the Gulf economies in the area of economic diversification. The major motivating factor behind Dubai economic diversification race was the fact that Dubai oil production is quite low, about 240,000 barrels per day, while its oil reserves are estimated currently at about 4 billion barrels per day. Hence, achieving economic diversification was crucial in order to ensure Dubai long-term development, and along with a major source for employment for the rapidly growing indigenous population. The growth rates are very high, although the indigenous population of Dubai are very small. One of the major tools to implement this economic diversification goal, along with development of international trade and, of course, financial sector, was the tourism industry. 5 minutes. I'm from Haifa, about 6. Can we bargain a bit? 6? Not including VAT, so it's 7 altogether. Okay, sorry. Trying. Okay. But Dubai is a unique case? Okay, never mind. Okay. All right, okay. So the tourism industry is one of the main tool to achieve it. And here what we can see is the number of guest hotel nights, and I will talk about it later. Since the mid-80s, Dubai tourism development has been extremely rapid, with tourism arrivals growth rate achieving about 10% on annual average, more than twice the worldwide average. By 2007, the number of tourist hotel nights in Dubai amounted to 16 million nights, more than double the number, as we can see here, in 2000. In recent years, Dubai's tourism industry expanded by as much as 14% a year, higher than in any other given destination worldwide. Indeed, Dubai achieved its goal of economic diversification, with the tourism industry alone in 2008 contribute directly 19% of the GDP, while the indirect contribution was about 30%. The rapid expansion of tourism industry, combined with Dubai liberal foreign investment policy, and of course the unimagined GDP growth rate, all of them together contribute to the rapid increase in real estate prices. And we can see here the Emirates Tower. The conference next year will be held in this one, I think, that on the left. This is another, where's Liora? This is another option for the next conference. And this is the Palm Island, the famous Palm Island. Okay. In September 2008, however, this wonderful economic environment ended, and Dubai economy has been on a roller coaster ride since then. The scale of the construction activity has declined by as much as 50% between August 8 and August 9. The construction of Dubai waterfront project to establish a new city of 1.5 million people stopped in October 2008. Works also came to halt in Dubai Land and, of course, at Dubai Palm Island. The sharp decline of Dubai's real estate and construction sector activities, a multiplier effect. There was a marked decline in the number of job opportunities, and there is a marked decline in overall economic atmosphere. Why has the global economic crisis hit Dubai so hard? Why is Dubai economic recession more severe than in other Gulf economies? It seems that the answer to these questions can be summarized in the following 6 points. Dubai is the smaller oil exporter among the Gulf. Dubai is the most integrated into the global economy. Dubai is the most dependent on the tourism industry, and the decline in real estate and rent prices was the highest in Dubai, and of course the sharp decline in private spending. And the development was mainly through borrowing, which is probably. Hence, the decline in real estate price made many of the investments not profitable. Overall, timely response by the GCC governments in the worldwide crisis brought about stability in the GCC economies at the time that most other worldwide economies were shaking. Hence, in recent months, the GCC economies have been returned to a solid growth. The higher than expected oil prices between $65 and $75 dollar per barrel in recent months contribute to the GCC economic recovery. A major sign of this recovery is the increase of recruitment of foreign labor since the third quarter, or the beginning of the third quarter of 2009. According to the projection of Saudi American Bank, the Samba, famous one, is that in 2010, the GDP growth rate of the GCC will recover to 3%, higher than in most developed economies worldwide. This relatively high economic growth rates, of course, is depend by first global economic recovery and, of course, oil prices. Okay, I will summarize. When Liora invited me to the conference about half a year ago, I told her that I would come only if the price per barrel will be about at least $60. She asked me why. Where's Liora? Do you remember? And I told her that since I fully identify with my research subject, namely the GCC economies, if oil prices would fall below $60 per barrel, the GCC economies would be in trouble. The second part, and this is the most important part, maybe the fund for the conference coming from oil. So we have to take it into consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, On. We were, of course, took into consideration the fact that you're from Haifa when we gave you a couple more minutes. If the panelists can come back, I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions, and we'll take all 3 questions, and then the panelists can respond accordingly. Just 1 second, just wait till everybody's come back up here, and then we can. So our first question will be Professor Tobias.
Thank you. I have a question to Anthony Cordesman and then comments to the second speaker. For Anthony Cordesman, according to my own knowledge, I think that the consumption of energy in the world is about half in the transport sector and the other half is other uses. So you are right in specifying that as long as the transport sector depends on liquid fuel, there is a big problem. But then my question is, as far as I know, grosso modo, half of the transport, half of the energy going to the transport sector is in the automobile sector, and the other one is grosso modo again to the air transport. Air transport, we are far away from getting away from liquid fuel. But as far as automobiles are concerned, there are glimmers of hope. How do you rate this assessment? Because it might influence some of your assessments in the medium run. That's my question to Anthony. The other one is about the matter of sanctions of Amos Nadan. I disagree with you when you say that sanctions do work better in the short run rather than in the long run. To begin with, you must distinguish between export sanctions and import sanctions, or export controls, etc. Do not forget that in the short run, the receiver has spare parts, the receiver has reserves, and can cope maybe with the sanctions because of that. But the more the pressure is maintained on him, it really becomes disturbing. We have seen this in Cuba, for example. The fact that you don't have spare parts makes that your automobiles, your machines, are not working anymore. So this matter of the long run and the short run, I would take it with a lot of care. Second, concerning the sanctions, very important for economists, is that, as you know, sanctions hit as well the senders than the receivers. And this is why it is important to know if you are referring to export sanction or import sanctions, of course, because exports tend to be more concentrated than imports, and therefore it might well be that the sender might have secondary influences on his own economy because he imposes sanctions.
Thank you very much. One more question, I think. Please.
I just wanted to ask Professor Cordesman, in that diagram, that slide you had showing the nuclear bomb.
There's a microphone behind you.
Showing the nuclear targeting in Iran that would devastate the country, you only referred to thermonuclear devices coming in, hydrogen bombs, I assume. And was that an implication that aside from the United States, China, Russia, and maybe England, that Israel might have a hydrogen bomb?
Okay, I think we can get the response of Professor Cordisman and perhaps the other speakers afterwards.
Let me begin with a question about the transportation sector. You actually have to look at the models. They make extremely optimistic assumptions about conversion of the transportation sector. The problem is that this is mandated by the congressional pressure on the Department of Energy. So they're already taking into account a far more favorable shift in the transportation sector over time than is actually likely to occur. Certainly in terms of hybrids and more efficient gasoline engines, those assumptions may or may not pay off. Electric cars are turning out to be a disaster. They may not be a disaster in the future, but at this point they are basically consuming more petroleum in terms of manufacture, battery, and other costs than they are saving. In terms of gasohol, the problem is that most gasohol is politically mandated and is distilled by burning petroleum, and it becomes a little bit of a joke in terms of the environmental benefits. The nuclear, this is something that Israelis find hard to discuss. I don't. Israel got access to French thermonuclear weapons designs as well as to fission designs. Does it have thermonuclear weapons? Almost certainly.
Well, okay. Maybe we hear something about sanctions on after that. Amos, do you have any quick response to Professor Tobias?
I think that, well, speaking about economic sanction, I'm familiar with the difference between import, export, and so on. I think that, and this was, in fact, the message, that if you run economic sanction, decide that you run whatever you can do. Now, if we speak about the case of Cuba, for example, and the question, I think that the debate that we have is what is short and what is long. I'm saying that long is a year, something like that. It's already long. And at that time, you would be able, in fact, to take a decision. Speaking about Cuba, Cuba is not a success of economic sanction running against Cuba to finish all the to change the activity of this country. In fact, you should speak about it. We speak about a change from a world managing or controlling by two superpowers, diverting into one superpower, and it was quite clear that whoever wants to be with that superpower need to make modification. We can also speak, if you go for things in the debate, there is a debate about Gaddafi, for example, saying sanction against Gaddafi worked. Eventually, he stopped. Okay, he said to the world, hey guys, come even and check if I have a weapon of mass destruction and so on and so forth. But this is not, and the Lockerbie case, of course. But this is not the issue, because the issue is that, in fact, Gaddafi decided to change his mind after the second invasion into Kuwait. And the second invasion into Kuwait, not the economic sanction, is the thing that works. And what I'm saying is that eventually we need to understand that economic sanctions are only part of all this game. And if you don't think that economics is the only game or the only game that exists, if you understand that it's limited, then you can take it into proportion. Economic sanction during the time became to be less efficient. Thanks.
Okay, we're running a little late. First of all, thank you to all of our participants, and there were 3 very interesting and enlightening lectures.